Good evening and welcome to this evening's study session of the City Council. Agendas for study sessions, including concept reviews, can be found by visiting Broomfield's website at broomfield.org. Our agenda this evening includes one study session item. Seeing there are no concept reviews on the agenda this evening, there will not be any public comment. The study session will be televised on Channel 8 and through live streaming on Broomfield's website. For our hearing impaired residents present, we have wireless headsets available in the back of the council chambers from our AV team. So our only study session item this evening is a presentation on the use of leaded fuel at Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and I'll ask our Deputy City and County Manager, Don Davis, to begin our discussion and introduce our presenters.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Pro Tem, Council. Tonight's study session will focus on the Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport and fuel use more specifically. We have two guest speakers with us tonight, Dr. Butel and Mr. Paul Anslow, who is also accompanied by Commissioner Tracy Kraft-Tharp from Jefferson County. So we welcome the Commissioner and our two special guests. Dr. Butel is a National Research Council Research Associate and Fellow at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. He is a seasoned chemist specializing in materials chemistry. Dr. Butel's expertise lies in nanomaterials, particularly those containing lead. During his graduate studies, he focused on embedding nanoparticles inside cells of biosensor applications. He also contributed to military research at HRL Labs involving lead nanoparticles and has created standard operating procedures for handling hazardous lead nanomaterials. Mr. Anslow is the Airport Director of Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport and has held that position since December of 2017. Mr. Anslow is a decorated and retired United States Marine aviator with extensive experience flying the CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopter. One of the significant highlights of his career was flying Presidents 42 and 43 on Marine One during the terms of Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Following his active duty service, he was selected as the Director of Safety at the Marine Corps Air Station in Hawaii, where he served prior to his current position at RMMA. Both speakers will be addressing operations and fuel use at RMMA from their perspectives, and once their presentations are complete, will be available for questions by council. So we'll have Dr. Butel will present first, sir, if you would join us at the podium, and then we'll be followed by Mr. Anslow, and we'll save the questions till the end. Thank you, Mayor. Dr. Butel.
Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Davis. So again, my name is Robert Butel. I'll be trying to help you understand this complex subject and to allow you to make informed decisions that will best help your community at large. Next slide. Mr. Davis did do a great job introducing my background, so I won't go over the slide very much, but I do want to say I probably don't have the highest authority to talk about this subject in Colorado. That belongs to Dr. Zaran, who I actually cite multiple papers across throughout my presentation. However, this presentation was made possible through the help and collaboration from colleagues, environmental scientists, doctors, and data scientists. So next slide. So toxicity, when we talk about leaded fuel, has three main factors. The first is how often an individual comes into contact with the substance. The second is how much material is required to affect the body to actually cause a physical health change. And third, how readily does this toxin uptake into the body, and how quickly can the body actually detoxify this toxin? So these are the main three factors. So next slide, we'll be talking about first, how much we're actually being exposed to lead from avgas itself. So next slide. So I see I don't have transitions, so that's fine. So a picture says 1,000 words, and you can kind of see in red on the far right is an outline of Broomfield itself. And I've kind of highlighted a few different sections on it, and you'll see this spaghetti mess is overflights across your communities from September of 2021. This is only a single month of exposure for your community. And this is because leaded fuel uses tetraethyl lead as a knockback preventative in the fuel to, and it gets expelled in the exhaust into the surrounding areas upon takeoff and climb out from the airport itself. So every single overflight, every single touch and go over a park, a community, a school is lead exposure. And so for your community, it's a little bit more complicated than the communities I've talked about before, such as Westminster and Superior, because you have two main areas that are affected. Those that are proximate to the airport, that are affected by the heavy traffic of touch and goes, and those who have the overflights. The touch and go patterns are kind of seen in the bottom left. An example of this, this is from September of 2020, showing the heavy traffic work going over Skystone and Stonegate communities, including Superior and Westminster. But also there is overflight shown by the green arrow on the right over your communities as well. I will be mainly focusing about those proximate to the community because that's where the most science exists. That's where the most studies have been done. And this is where I can really point to and say, yes, the scientific community has come to consensus. That does not mean that those overflights do not affect your community. A good example of this is in Middleton, Wisconsin, where they have an airport that has only 44,000 operations per year. They went out and tested and found that their community 4 miles out are heavily impacted by overflights. I don't show this data because it doesn't reach my bar of actually showing you, which means it's not a published scientific paper. But they found two interesting facts, which are that those most impacted are in line with the traffic ways, if you would so call it. So those with heavy traffic pattern and due to the seasons. So I can't really do apples to apples comparison because I don't know, does Middleton, Wisconsin have inversion layers that trap the nanoparticulates in the air affecting the communities? What are the winds like? I don't have these factors, so I don't present them here. However, they did test, they did find that they were able to see measurable lead in the air, and they found lead in the well waters of surrounding communities as well. This is only 44,000 operations per year compared to 262,000 operations per year in 2022. So next slide. So how much lead is actually being expelled in the community at large? So like I said before, the leaded avgas fuel has tetraethyl lead, which is a compound that prevents knockback, but it also has lead in it as well. For every gallon of gas sold at RMMA, it contains 2.12 grams of lead. This equates to 1.25 ton of lead expelled into the community just for 2021 alone. 2022, sorry. 95% of that gets expelled into the communities. 5% basically gets absorbed into the oil itself. Next slide. And you might say, well, it's dispersed into the surroundings. Well, turns out Broomfield's actually in the climb out phase of the going to the northern training grounds up north. So not only during the touch and goes, which are considered a continuous takeoff and landing, but also when they're climbing out and trying to reach altitude 3-4 miles away from the airport, that is where most of the emissions happen over your communities. Next slide. So in Superior, we knew that there was lead in the fuels, but we didn't know how much this was affecting our communities. Was this quantifiable? What were we going to find? We had no idea. We heard about the Reed Hillview study where they saw people with elevated blood lead levels. We wanted to know, are we affected the same amount in our community? So we went out and tested 9 homes, 2 samples each, just to see if we were going to see any lead whatsoever. We basically swabbed down windowsills and measured how much lead was actually in the homes. And the results were, to me, surprising and very, very scary. And the reason why is because while the 4th highest sample I'm showing here is 5.4 micrograms, the concentration was insanely high. So the EPA dictates that the safe levels of lead in the ground is a parts per million. So if I have a kilogram of sample, I'm expecting a microgram of lead in that ground. So we're swabbing dust in windowsills. If you imagine how much mass is in dust in windowsills, that's milligrams amount. You can kind of think about this in a different way, where if you think about a scoop for a cup of coffee, of coffee grounds, that's about 7 grams. And we're talking about milligrams amount, so 1,000 times less than that. And we're finding micrograms, which is a parts per thousand. And so that is very, very scary because we have a concentrated level of lead on this windowsill. And this could not happen if it just came from dust from the surrounding community. So the question is, well, where did this come from? Next slide. We know it didn't come from the Marshall Fire, because this is a question that always comes on up when I give this presentation or to the community in general. Could it have come from a different source where the fires happened and burned and went across Colorado? Well, Colorado Department or at least Boulder did a study and actually looked at the ground samples, and they found that in areas affected by the fire, there was no increase in lead levels in the surrounding areas. So this lead did not come from the fires. In fact, they actually saw that it was within range, well within the standard for EPA being a parts per million amount of lead in the soil. So that's safe. So where did it come from? If it didn't come from the ground, it had to come from a high emission source that would mix in with the dust from the surrounding community to raise the concentration of lead on those windowsills. Next slide. And the only source of lead that is within miles of our communities are the airports. You can see the 598, which is pounds emitted per year in 2017. From Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. I also point out Erie, the 526 in the middle to middle right, that also emitted in your community as well. So the lead is impacting the communities, and it's basically being spread across everywhere. All other sources of lead are orders of magnitude below that. So the only source of where the lead could have come from is from the leaded fuel. Next slide. So we know we're being exposed to lead. So the question is, how much material is actually required to affect the human body? Next slide. Turns out, not very much. So lead affects children most significantly. This makes sense because they're a smaller vessel exposed to the same amount of material, so they uptake it faster into their bodies. And also they are more affected because lead interferes with the calcium pathways of the neurons. So when they are young, in school, trying to make neural connections, trying to grow their brain, the lead inhibits this. So this leads to lower IQ, decreased ability to pay attention, and underperformance in school. A great A/B test of this was in Florida when NASCAR finally decided to get rid of leaded fuel for their races. A nearby school with an incoming cohort that did not get exposed to lead had significantly increased grade scores compared to their previous cohorts. There was no change in the curriculum, no change in teachers, the same exact standard test, and yet the incoming cohort that was not exposed to lead did significantly better. And people always ask, well, what is the cost of this? If we were to put a number on this. A doctor from Columbia actually did this study in 2008, that if you increase a single child's blood by 1 microgram per deciliter, it has a societal cost of $50,000. And that was in 2008. In today's money, that's $71,000 per child. So it has significant impacts on the community as a whole. And this makes sense. If you have decreased test scores and ability to perform well in school, you see higher dropout rates, you see higher crime, underperforming jobs. You get lower paying jobs as you go forward. So it is a snowball effect, which is why you want to try to stop it as early as possible, because these effects are permanent in children. Next slide. So how little do we actually need? So I talked about 5 micrograms found on the windowsill. Turns out you only need 2 micrograms per deciliter in your blood to actually see quantifiable IQ deficiencies in children. So you do not need very, very much. And in fact, the lowest level detection of blood is oftentimes around the 2 microgram level. So by the time you actually detect it in children, it is already too late for them. So it's important you get ahead of this and not fall behind in this process. This is why a coalition of doctors sent a signed letter to Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport in 2022 asking to halt the expansion until Colorado Department of Health conducts a lead study in the airport. Next slide. So we talked about how we were being exposed to this lead. We talked about how it requires very little to actually affect children in communities. Now, how readily do we actually uptake it, and how dangerous is actually this chemical itself? So the best way to think about this is if I put a kilogram of lead in front of you, while alarming, it was not, the CDC and the EPA did not consider that dangerous. You cannot ingest it, you cannot inject it, you cannot inhale it. But if I start breaking up these particles into small nanoscopic objects, then it can readily penetrate your lungs and get absorbed into your body. There was a study done in 2013 looking at exactly this. They looked at nanoparticles 4 to 40 nanometers in size, and seeing how and larger, and seeing how they penetrated the cells of the lungs. They found that particles 18 nanometers and smaller readily passed through, while 40 nanometers and larger did not. So next slide. So with this in mind, Griffiths in 2020 looked at what are the emissions of these particles from an aircraft. Turns out they are perfect for penetrating the lungs of your body, 13 nanometers and smaller. Compared to archaic automotive engines that use lead, those are much larger in size, so they didn't affect you as much. So this leaded fuel from avgas is far more toxic compared to that of leaded fuel from cars. And there was a huge hubbub back in the 60s and 70s trying to remove leaded, actually tetraethyl lead from car engines, the same compound that is used today in avgas. Next slide. So how do we kind of connect it all together? How do we kind of look at this as a whole? So we know we're being exposed. We know that it takes very little to affect our bodies, and we know it penetrates very quickly into our bodies. So so how do we connect this to avgas? So I'm presenting here the paper brought forth by Dr. Zaran from Colorado, looking at the Reed-Hillview Airport, because they are concerned about this as well. And they were wondering, are they actually going to see elevated blood lead levels in the surrounding communities because it has such a strong effect? Also something else I want to point out is that even though spoiler, they did find elevated blood lead levels, but even though they did find elevated blood lead levels, the surrounding soil did not have elevated lead contaminant. And this is because it is so easily inhaled compared to ingested, which is what the CDC and EPA normally look at. It still affects us that much more significantly. So next slide. So here are the key findings for the Reed-Hillview Airport study. They found that the lead-formulated aviation, which is also known as avgas, was a primary source of lead emissions in the United States today. They also analyzed 14,000 blood lead samples from children under the age of 5 residing proximate to the airport. And they found that with increased piston engine traffic and quantities of avgas sold at the airport, that the blood lead levels increased. So the more avgas you sold and the more activity at the airport happened, the higher blood lead levels they were going to find. And in support of the scientific education, the EPA's recent announcement of endangerment finding, they really support the endangerment finding from the EPA, was one of the major findings here. And this, I'm just showing this study because this is a huge culmination over many years of work, many thousands of blood samples showing this. But this isn't the only study showing this. Dr. Miranda in North Carolina showed the exact same thing. University of Chicago showed the exact same thing at multiple different airports, that this is a real effect. And this is a scientific community consensus that this is real. So next slide. So we talked about proximate to the airport. So what does it exactly mean? So in the paper that Dr. Zaran put forth, the major areas were about 0.5 miles out and 1.5 miles out, looking at these communities. I've kind of stolen Broomfield's noise abatement maps, showing different areas, and you can kind of see Stonegate within the 1.5 mile range, and Skystone as well, including a few of the communities. The one that I'm going to tell you to ignore is the purple one within the 0.5 mile range, because that is actually unless you do care, it is actually a flight school, Spartan Aviation, but I think they can handle themselves. So next slide. I know we're talking about Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. However, Anthem Ranch is very close to Erie Airport, so it's something that you should be also pay attention to as well. They are within that 0.5 mile danger zone, which is the most affected area proximate to an airport. So next slide. So here's the good, bad, and ugly. So I did mention that at least around Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, there is nothing within the 0.5 mile radius of the airport. However, even past that 0.5 to 1.5 miles from the airport, you are still affected by the avgas fuel sales and activity from the airport, because even though it's from that point source, it starts to spread from that point source into the surrounding communities. In fact, they found that they experienced a modest amount of increase of blood lead levels of about 0.16 micrograms per deciliter. I should take a step back and explain this graph. So you see on the graph on the left, the y-axis is predicted blood lead levels based off of monthly avgas fuel sales. And you can see from the paper, it goes from about 5,000 gallons of fuel sold to the airport to 35,000. Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport in 2022 sold 45,000. So they are off the chart of this graph from the Reed-Hillview study by about 30%. And from the Reed-Hillview study, they saw that you saw a modest 0.16 micrograms per deciliter increase at the maximum. And for children under the age of 2, this effect was doubled to 0.32 micrograms per deciliter. Compared to the Flint water crisis, this is almost equivalent in blood lead levels surging higher. And this is a compounding effect. Your body has no good way of removing lead from the body. So as you get more and more exposed to the lead, it starts building up in your system, and it's very hard to take out. Only until you reach to a high level will they actually medically intervene and chelate and try to remove it from your body itself. So next slide. So I said a lot of doom and gloom, but there are some things you can do to protect yourselves and your communities. This is taken not only my suggestions, but suggestions from the CDC and other communities from California who looked into this as well. Mainly, you should get your blood tested. It helps to determine how at risk you are. I know a lot of people from the community, in my community, have gotten tested, and they have found that they have elevated blood lead levels. I know from people from Westminster have gotten tested, and they have elevated blood lead levels. Just to give a few examples, in my community, I've seen 2.0 micrograms per deciliter nearby my house. And even outside of that 1.5 range, that 1.5 mile range, we've seen members test high for lead as well, 1.8. Those in Westminster I've seen as high as 3.5, but the worst, in my opinion, by far, was a family came into my community in Rock Creek. They've lived in their house for 4 months and had a 3-month-old. Therefore, the child lived in that house the entire time, and that baby came back and tested for 3.0 micrograms per deciliter. It's heartbreaking seeing people from our community being affected already by this. So ways you can protect yourself is you should dry dust you should not dry dust, because that spreads the particulate around. You should wet dust. Keep your windows and doors closed. And if you want to go above and beyond, pay for air conditioning for those who have low income housing. Others include avoid eating fruits and vegetables from your backyards, because not only can it be covered in the lead, but also it can be absorbed from the soil. Think about the disclosures you have to sign in Layton for the plutonium in the ground. The exact same thing happens here. I will keep it brief. You can read on at your own leisure later on. So next slide. Something else that can be done, since this is the amount of operations and amount of overflights impacts your communities, something you can do is ask Jefferson County to institute landing fees at Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. And just don't take my word for it. There were 2 consulting firms that actually came forward with this exact same idea. ABC ×2 in 2018, and I believe HMMH brought it forth as an idea for the CNR as well. Devin can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that is the case. It's a simple idea. Basically, every single time wheels touch the ground, a small fee is added to the pilot. This would discourage touch and goes, and it would create revenue for Jeffco as well. Second, you can also follow up with a 2022 letter asking Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport to stop expansion until Colorado Department of Public Health has done a full lead investigation to fully realize what are the impacts and how can we mitigate these impacts. Third, so next slide. The other thing you can look at, so this is mainly things that are proximate to the airport. However, we've talked about these overflights, and the reason why they're doing these overflights is because they're going to training grounds to the north that have been arbitrarily chosen. Now, some are going to other airports to train, but actually a good majority, a large portion of them, about 20 to 25%, and we have the data to show this, don't touch a single other airport to go up to train. And therefore they could find a training ground down south. And it's not too far away to actually head down there either. Here are different radiuses of distances to these training grounds north that they fly over you to get to. They could find something down further south as well. I don't particularly like this solution personally, because it is the old saying, the solution to pollution is dilution. But if you can try to keep the blood levels down below enough below into the noise level, you could see an effect that you could mitigate this effect as well. Next slide. And finally, you can ask Rocky Metropolitan Airport to offer unleaded fuel. I will say that I've heard that this slide is a little bit dated since I last put it forth. Mr. Anslow will probably give an update from here, but there is unleaded fuel already available. Swift was available in 2014, and the airport has known about it since at least 2018. They also had petitions sent to them in 2020 and 21 asking them to offer unleaded fuel at the airport. So it's not a new concept to offer unleaded fuel. It's offered at many airports across the country already. There was also a fear of, if you offer this unleaded fuel that may not be intermixable with leaded fuel, that something might happen. In the 9 years that Swift has been available, there has been not a single misfueling of 94 unleaded fuel. So whatever Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport decides to put as an unleaded offering, I am confident that they will be able to correctly fill up the correct airplanes. So with that, I basically conclude, and I look forward to your questions afterwards.
Thank you, Dr. Patel. We appreciate that. If we could pull up Mr. Anslow's presentation. And Mr. Anslow, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Next slide. It's good evening. I'm going to start off with a quick background of the airport, and then we'll transition to talk about leaded fuel. Next slide. So Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, formerly known as Jeffco, was founded in 1960. It's owned and operated by Jefferson County. You'll also hear the term sponsor. That's an FAA term. So Jefferson County is the sponsor of the airport. We are the third busiest airport in Colorado. We are officially designated as a reliever for Denver International. We have over 400 based aircraft, approximately 50 businesses, and we are a major economic impact to the community. Obviously, you guys are aware of Ball Corporation. It's at the airport. In 2020, CDOT did a study that they do at all the airports in Colorado. And in 2020, we're informed that we are basically $730 million in economic impact every year. We believe, because of the growth that we've seen and the industry that we've seen, that we're well over $1 billion. And in 2024, another study will come out, and I think that'll show that. Next slide. Okay, just as some background to know what we can control, what Jefferson County control is. Jefferson County, as I mentioned, is the sponsor, and they have hired me to run the airport, Rocky Mountain Metro Airport. And as such, I do mostly property management. I manage 400 leases for hangars and different businesses. And I also am in charge of the ground. So I take care of the taxiways, the runways, the airfield, the grass, anything on the ground. The federal government has the FAA that runs all the airspace and all the airports in the country. They are in charge of air traffic control and airspace regulations. So when people say, oh, why doesn't Paul tell people they can't fly to the north? Or why I have no authority, nor does Jefferson County. They're also, the FAA is also in charge of grants. So they pay money to all airports that follow the rules. And that's how we maintain our airport in the standard that it is. We also have the Airport Advisory Board, which is a group of 7 individuals who advise the commissioners and work with the airport staff on how to make the airport successful, because we don't get county money. There are no general funds that go from Jefferson County to the airport. We are 100% self-sustaining. As part of that, also, there's the Noise Roundtable that meets monthly. And again, they work with the airport and the airport staff and the communities to try to come up with viable solutions. Next slide, please. So when the FAA gives grants, and over the last 20 years, we were around $115 million in grants that the FAA gives us to run our airport. We sign, or actually the commissioners sign, 39 grant assurances. Those are the rules to accept that money. And some of the important ones are, we will make the airport available as an airport for public use on reasonable terms without unjust discrimination to all types, kinds, and classes of aeronautical activities. And then it says, including commercial aeronautical, because most airports are fighting that want commercial air service. The towns say, well, we don't want that. It's too much noise, too much traffic. And as an airport, we cannot discriminate. In our case, you hear a lot of people complaining about the flight schools. They want us to get rid of the flight schools. Again, they pay their rent. They're following the rules. I can't just say, you know, I really want less noise phone calls coming to my staff. We're going to not allow any more flight schools, or we're not going to allow the current flight schools to stay here in business. So we are not allowed to discriminate. The other thing that's important is we have to maintain a fee and rental structure for the facilities and services at the airport, which will make the airport as self-sustaining as possible. I have to be self-sustaining if at all possible. Some smaller airports that don't have the large businesses basically get county funds, and that's legal, but the FAA says we really don't want that to occur. And we have been, since it's our inception in 1960, self-sustaining. Next slide, please. So we're here tonight to talk about leaded fuel. So next slide. So as Dr. Boutel mentioned, we have two kinds of gas currently. One is Jet A, which is what commercial airliners, business jets use. And then avgas, or 100 low lead, that's both synonymously used, which are in the small piston aircraft, which you see the picture of. It's important to note that only about 10% of the fuel that we sell is leaded fuel. The rest of it is the Jet A. So in that heat map that was shown, that with all those black lines, that's not accurate, because that pictures every single aircraft that comes in and out of our airport, and only 10% of our airplanes are using unleaded fuel. So I'm not saying that there's not a lot of it, but that is not an accurate slide. The vast majority of those piston aircrafts use and are certified, and that's an important part of this. The FAA certifies fuel, and really anything you do with the plane has to go through the FAA, and they're certified to use the 100 low lead. What you see on the pictures to the right are, it says avgas only. That's actually the fuel port on a wing of a Cessna 172. And in the pilot handbook, which is the writing, it also says the fuel, what's approved. So again, to do that, that has to be approved by the FAA. So we can say, hey, what fuel can this aircraft use? And each aircraft is different. Next slide, please. So a very common misconception is people say you need to stop selling leaded fuel. Jefferson County and the airport do not sell 1 gallon of fuel. We have 2 businesses that legally sell a legal product. We have leases with them. They've invested a lot, and they're basically called FBOs. They service all aircraft. And so they service the business jets, the commercial liners, aircraft coming in for the CU games. And they sell the fuel, we do not. And it's that fuel that is by private industry that sells it. And there's a picture of our fuel farm. So we have the FBOs on those fuel tanks, and they get their fuel delivered, and then they put that in the trucks and then ultimately deliver it into the aircraft. Next slide. Okay, so how do we transition from 100 low lead to an unleaded gas? So first and foremost, there has to be a development of a safe alternative. We're at that point. Second of all, we need FAA approval, and which we've recently got for both Swift 94 unleaded and GAMI. Swift and GAMI are both companies, and GAMI has a 100 unleaded fuel. After that, you need a specific aircraft approval. That's what I talked about. You can't own a plane and do something to it and add a fuel that's not allowed by the FAA. So you have to go get a type certificate, and that's available and ongoing. More importantly, the infrastructure. So this is just starting to come out. Remember, there's 19,000 airports in our country right now. All those airports are transitioning to unleaded fuel. And so to be able to do that takes infrastructure. You have to be able to ship it to different airports. So there's a lot to be done before we can just say, hey, we're just going to switch over. And then that again that's ongoing. And then ultimately the FBO infrastructure investment. So in your minds, if you think about fuel, avgas and unleaded, low lead are like diesel and gas for your car. If you put the wrong fuel in your plane, that engine's going to have problems and you could come down and have a mishap. It's not like if you put diesel in your gas car or vice versa, and all of a sudden your engine starts knocking, you just pull off to the side of the road. When you're in a plane, there's nowhere to go but down. So that part is really, really important. So to do that and to keep those ecosystems completely separate, you need a separate fuel truck to deliver that fuel to the planes. You also need a separate tank to store it in, because you can't be mixing and matching it the tanks and in the trucks. Those have to be separate things. The FBOs are businesses. They operate on demand, and right now there's no demand for that, or I would just say limited demand for that fuel right now. And they haven't, to be able to spend about $1 million to get that infrastructure in, they're still kind of on the wait and see things. The FAA's stated goal is to transition away from leaded gas by 2030. So we ultimately have till 2030 to do this. But what are we doing at Rocky Mountain Metro Airport? Next slide, please. We're looking to get a faster transition to that. And the way we're going to do that is 94 UL, which is from the Swift company, is approved for that type certificate, which is what I talked about. So if I own a plane, I have to apply to the FAA, send them all the data on my plane, and they send you back a certificate that you then attach to the wing of your plane and put into your pilot handbook. With that 94 UL from Swift, 66% of all piston aircraft are able to use that. So that's where that risk of misfueling an aircraft, and that's not 100%. If you put that fuel into a wrong aircraft, you're going to have problems. That STC requires the installation of placards in a pilot handbook. It was implemented at Centennial this summer by one of three FBOs. Important thing to notice is Centennial is a great airport. We have a great relations with us. We're our competition, but it's a friendly competition. They had $4 million of their own money that they were going to spend on updating their control tower. At the last minute, the FAA says, hey, we have $4 million of excess money that wasn't spent. We're going to give you guys a grant. So they won the lottery, a $4 million lottery. So what they did is they transitioned an existing fuel tank, an existing truck from one of their FBOs, and they're supplementing the cost difference. They supplemented the cost to clean those tanks and get those tanks ready to fuel. I applaud them, but again, give me $4 million. I can do a lot of good with it too. They are working, the Swift company is working to create a 100 ultra unleaded gas so that it could be used in all aircraft, not just the 66%. Next slide, please. The other option is to go with the GAMI 100, which is available for 100% of the piston aircraft. Again, it needs a STC. It is a drop-in replacement, and all of them are available. And it was approved in September of 2022. Same thing, it requires the placards and a pilot supplement, and it is will appear more widely in a market in 2024. So they just got approved and they're just ramping up the production and then ultimately the distribution of it. They are behind the Swift fuels. So that's kind of the decision point of where we are at. Do we move ahead forward or do we wait until the GAMI is available? And next slide. So Swift is available now, not in a huge market. It's still limited, but because Centennial started it, we're able to get it. Not as cheap as regular gas, but we can get it. Whereas the 100 from GAMI is still 2 or 3 years away from distribution and ultimately the ability to get it to Colorado. They both require an STC. The Swift is good for 66% of the fleet. The GAMI is able to be put into 100% of the fleet. There is a risk, and it is a real risk, of misfueling an aircraft. And here's the reason why. One of our flight schools, because we talked to the flight schools, we talked to the FBOs, I've talked to the engine engineers, I've talked to Swift and GAMI CEOs. This is a priority for both Rocky Mountain and the airport. But one of our flight schools at 10 o'clock at night, when basically the flights kind of all end, there may be one or two out, their standing orders, all the FBO goes through and tops off all of their planes. And if you were to go down a flight line, daytime or nighttime, and you got to think about an 18 or 19-year-old kid, maybe going to college or just working at the airport, he's fueling planes. When he looks at one plane, he has to look at that placard to make sure it's the right one. That's the only thing that tells him that plane can't accept that fuel. If when you look at them, you can't tell from the outside. The engines are inside, it's different horsepower, different compression, different items. So there is a real risk of misfueling. So that's why we have to be very concerned. Again, the cost of making a mistake can be dramatic. In 100 lead, it's good for ready. And there's, basically it then eliminates that risk. Next slide. So what do we have at the airport today? We have both fixed operators on the field maintain fuel trucks and fuel tanks for the 100 low lead. There's a picture of the tanks and there's a picture of the trucks. Unleaded fuel will require the installation of new tanks and the purchase of new unleaded trucks or conversion of existing equipment. So Centennial have 4 FBOs, we have 2, and they had an FBO that didn't have a tank and a truck that was being used. So they did a conversion, a much cheaper option than go ahead and installing new. Next slide, please. So again, in consultation with the commissioners and my staff and the FAA, this has been going on for since February of 2023, when this really became an issue. This has been the priority of both the commissioners and the airport. And we purchased our own fuel truck. So the airport now owns a fuel truck that we can be able, that is ready to start servicing with 94 unleaded fuel. We are also, I got permission this morning and we're applying for a grant for a tank. So between the tank and the truck, it's around $800,000 to $1 million that the airport is spending to install a tank so that we can be able to start servicing. And our goal, and I believe it's a reasonable goal, is to start selling at least to 66% of our fleet unleaded fuel by the end of 2024. So the Eagle program, if you remember, goes all the way out to 2030. And the FAA reauthorization bill is going to probably come out and say, you must maintain the ability to sell unleaded fuel, leaded fuel all the way out to 2030, because they want to make sure that every pilot has the opportunity to go through that STC and go through that process. We're purchasing a 12,000 gallon tank so that we can get a full load from the distributor. And ultimately that'll keep our costs down. But it's also important to note that even with all the steps that we're doing, the cost difference is about $1 to $1.30 a gallon. There are some side benefits to using the unleaded fuel. You don't have to change the spark plugs as much. There's some maintenance requirements that drop down. So in the end, when we're working with our flight schools, who 3 of the flight schools have signed on and said, we're in, get us the fuel and we'll start using it. We have to work as a partnership between the flight schools, the FBOs, and the airport to be able to make it marketable for them. Because again, what if the flight schools have to charge, $1 more a gallon and they go out for an hour and they burn 8 gallons, you're putting that cost onto the student. So we want to keep those costs low. We're going through those steps right now so that when we do get those tanks installed, when we get that fuel delivered, it's at least a marketable difference for the FBOs ultimately, and for the flight schools and the private plane owners, that they can have that fuel and start using it. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do we transition to that fleet to all of our 400 aircraft, 100 of which are owned by the flight schools? Already talked about that STC. That type certificate costs money. It's basically estimated to cost between $200 and $1,500 per aircraft, depending on horsepower. That flight school transition, if you have anywhere between 20 and 30 planes for a flight school, could equate to between $10,000 and $15,000. I've actually updated this slide because originally I said, well, when we get all the FAA grants and the money comes through and all this thing, we'll go ahead and supplement the STCs and we'll invest in that and pay for that. Since the airport's now spending its own money on trucks and tanks and stuff, we have to determine budget wise. So we have to figure out how that works. But our goal is to make it as easy as possible for the flight schools and the private plane owners transition, get those SDCs, pay that cost. Most likely we'll give a rent deduction for, a month or two so that people can take that money and get the SDCs, make it easier for them to transition. Next slide, please. Okay, with that, I'm available for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anslow and Dr. Boutel. Those are very, very informative presentations. I will go ahead and see if any of my council colleagues have any questions. Who wants to go first? Councilmember Delgadillo.
All right, thank you both for that presentation. So my first question, I have three questions. First two are about kind of the first presentation from Dr. Boutel. Do we have any information that speaks to the impact of lead on senior citizens, anyone with a pre-existing health condition, anything like that? And the reason I ask is because Skystone is in our ward. That is an active 55+ community, and they're the ones who are getting the brunt of what we're seeing here.
The short answer is yes. The long answer is I don't know exactly at what point or what lead levels you actually start seeing these effects. I would say talk to your doctor about that. Mostly the most impacted are children. However, it does impact adults as well. Usually hypertension, blood related things, some dementia. It affects basically the whole body, but it depends on how much you have in your body.
All right, thank you. And then my second piece of advice, it's kind of a corollary of when you advise to keep windows closed. How does that impact outdoor recreation for those in close proximity to an airport?
So the answer is that they are going to be impacted. If you have heavy traffic over you and you are outdoor doing a physical exercise, you are going to inhale those particles and those are going to get absorbed into your system. So there's no good solution around that. The particles are too small. You can't really say wear a mask. So the best advice is basically to avoid outdoor activity when there's high traffic outside, which is quite a shame because it happens during the summer.
All right, that's still helpful. I appreciate the clear answers regardless. And then the kind of final question for Mr. Anslow is about, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but what exactly does the protocol look like for refueling? Because it kind of mentioned that there's one person after folks have gone away looking at that label or that placard and making that decision. Is there anything else that goes on? Any other people engaging with that?
So with 400 aircraft, 4 different flight schools, it's hard to just say, well, this is our protocol. Oftentimes pilots don't want to fill up their tanks and pull their plane into a hangar where it could expand and leak out. So they do it just prior to their flight. So they'll call the FBO and say, hey, I'm going to take off at 11. Can you swing by 10:30? Some flight schools have it on demand. So when the plane comes back, they call and say, hey, we're landing. Can we come fuel us? And so that's an ongoing thing the whole, during the day. This one flight school does that, but then at the end of the day, they top off all their aircraft. So that first thing, and the reason they do that is because in the evening, it's generally cooler and they're not worried about that expansion of the fuel. So there's no one protocol. It's different for every plane, every flight school, every, owner.
Okay, got it. That's helpful. Those are my questions. I will say one comment, and I appreciate the transition. The clarification about how much leaded fuel traffic kind of occurs overhead. And I do appreciate the efforts to transition before that 2030 mark. It's important for our community that we're doing that. We're keeping folks safe for public health. So I do appreciate those efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Lim.
Yes, I'll start with, I have some questions for Mr. Anslow while he's there. Thank you.
Thanks.
So you pointed to, I guess it was condition 22 of some nature in the FAA grant assurances as, in particular, where it said you had to make these services available to the public without unjust discrimination. So my interpretation of what you were saying was that you feel like you have to be able to still service both planes that use leaded and unleaded fuel. Is that correct? Is that where you were going with that?
So that's correct and incorrect. So the correct part of it is, yes, it's actually the FAA says, and the FAA reauthorization bill that's going through Congress right now is saying we must maintain leaded fuel all the way out till 2030. That gives the people, remember, a plane is not stuck at one airport. We get planes from around the world, around the country. So if someone hasn't switched over to unleaded fuel, at least until 2030, we have to at least offer leaded fuel. The FAA grant assurances basically say we can't discriminate. So that means I can't, I get a lot of calls saying, we'll just close down the flight schools. Just don't allow flight schools to fly there. Get rid of the flight schools. That's the part about the discrimination that I can't say, I don't want business jets, or I don't want flight schools, or I don't want this type of aircraft or this type of business. We are federally funded. We follow the rules. And so what we did in 2022 is we created a strategic business plan at the airport. And what that allows me to do is actually say, if a company comes in, let's say Embry-Riddle, if you guys are all familiar with that, it's one of the largest flight schools in the world. If they came in and said, we really want a high altitude West Coast campus. We want to bring in 200 flight school or 200 aircraft and run a flight school out of there. Before that strategic business plan, if they had the cash to pay the rent and build their facility, I had no recourse but say, come on in. Now I could say, you know what, that really isn't the highest and best use at this airport in this area. And that gives me the authority and the ability to tell the FAA, because the FAA is going to look into it. They go, yeah, Paul laid out a plan on what the highest and best use is. And so you can, it's not discriminate, but it's basically use what's the plan for the best and highest use of the airport. So you're correct. You were correct in both incidences.
So I was just trying to figure out the influence that if the FAA were to somehow at that level decide that the date of 2030 should be moved forward, how much impact would that have locally? If you said you have your own strategic business plan that is actually more impactful now.
Mhm.
And would that national FAA deadline being moved forward impact how quickly we did things locally?
So I would say in a general term, yes. For us as Rocky Mountain Metro, we're doing the transition, next year. So it'll have less impact on us. But if they said you have to transition in 2025, then every pilot and plane owner would have to go get those STCs. The FBOs would be mandated to supply the fuel for them. So, we're a very regulated business and a very regulated industry. And so if the FAA comes out and says you will do something, we'll all do it. So I think if they did come out and say, you really need to speed that up and we want everybody transitioned by an earlier date, it would have a very large impact. Again, less on us and probably less on Centennial because we're already, kind of ahead of the curve. But there's a lot of airports that don't have the money to be able to start that now. And they're going to have to wait for funding and other resources. And I think eventually, and this is just my own thought, Congress is going to allocate funds to allow airports, and it'll be through the FAA, but they're going to allocate very specific funds that says, we're going to buy these tanks, we're going to buy these fuel trucks, we're going to do this, because there are small airports out there that there's no way they can afford this. But they still have to, they're still being mandated by 2030. So that's, I think, the answer. And we're working with our congressional leaders to try to get some of those funds to try to speed this up even more.
Dr. Patel alluded to the fact that there were some recommendations made by consultants earlier for landing fees that were not instituted. Can you address that as factual, or what happened to that?
They were one of, 18, 15 recommendations of a consultant that was not hired by the airport. They were hired by, I believe it was the town of Superior and maybe Louisville. And we reviewed those and we actually did a study. And as a fact, the FAA FSDO, which is Flight Service District, so the head guy in Denver, Utah, Colorado, basically he owns 1,700 airports, basically came out and said in all those states, there's 2 GA airports that do landing fees. They are rare. They don't raise income for Jefferson County. They don't stop operations. As a matter of fact, because letters to the FAA requesting us to do landing fees to limit operations. The FAA says you can't do them because now they want them to do them to limit operations. Remember, it's discrimination in access. And the other one is the current consultant that's working with the roundtable. And again, they throw out ideas about how we could do this. I will tell you that landing fees don't stop operations. If you are a based aircraft, you don't pay landing fees. So all of our flight schools, if you are under 12,500, you're not paying landing fees. No flight school plane is over 12,500. They do them at very small, specific airports. Most of them are tied to contracts with commercial carriers. So you see like Telluride, Aspen, airplanes, places like that have, no ramp space, very limited, but a very high demand area. Those airports do landing fees, but they are not going to do what people want them to do, which is limit operations. Again, whether it's 10 cents or $10, the planes that are landing at our airport are not paying that. And what you find is the administrative cost to administer those landing fees and actually figure out how to collect them costs more than the money you bring in.
Thank you. Then I have a question, 3 questions for Dr. Patel. So you referred to the fact that there were, in 2022, there were doctors that sent a letter to RMMA asking for holding expansion until the CDPHE did a study. Did you have a response to the CDPHE that this study is pending shortly, or what was your indication that that was a possibility?
So the letter was, which you have, I sent it to Mr. Davis for you all to look over, was basically a statement to Jefferson County and to Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport to cease expansion until the Department of Public Health, Colorado Department of Public Health, did a lead study. As far as I'm aware, there was no response from Jefferson County, but you can ask, I don't want to put Tracy on the spot, but you can ask Tracy Kraft Tharp if there was a response, because as far as I'm aware, there was no response to that. And therefore, since there was no engagement or asking the Department of Public Health to do a lead study, there's no study in the works. There's nothing coming about.
Okay. Let's see, you're there. When you outlined the steps for education, how do you propose that it would be best for that information to get disseminated? I mean, are you proposing, there's steps for mitigation. Do you propose that should be disseminated by counties, the airport itself, or how do you see that spreading more readily?
So I kind of envision it's your county and you know your people the best, and you would know how they might take to this news. I would just recommend one of your newsletters or maybe a flyer campaign basically saying, hey, you are nearby an airport and it has lead, and here are the dangers of lead. Here's what we recommend to keep you safe. And people can choose what to go through. Some people might say, bah humbug, my fruit from my backyard is the best. I'm just still going to eat it. And that's their personal choice. But each person, I believe, should be educated and make that own risk assessment themselves. So that is my recommendation, is basically just to get the word far and wide that they are impacted by this lead. And to try to take and here are some suggestions to actually help with that.
Okay, one more question for him. When you were showing the heat map.
Correct.
Were those flights that used the Jet A or the avgas fuel? I mean, did you distinguish in that heat map? Yes,
that's a very good question. I'm glad you brought that up. So there was a data scientist from Louisville who actually pulls all the data, filters it, and cleans it up. And that heat map is only piston aircrafts. No commercial air flight, no Jet A, no helicopters either, which can use avgas. Only piston aircraft such as a Cessna, Pipers, etc., from flight schools or other flights.
Okay, good. Those are my questions. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mayor. Wanted to follow up, make sure I understood. You said that 10% of planes or 10% of your fuel sales are leaded, right? So is that 10% of planes, and which planes would that be? Is that flight school planes, or is that?
We don't like to say just flight school planes, because if you and I owned a plane, it would most likely be a small piston aircraft. So it's general aviation planes.
You showed the picture of the small plane, which would be typically a type flight school plane.
That's correct.
Correct. So it's generally those, it's not the jets that are coming in.
That's
It's
correct.
not the charters that are coming in. And the airport has experienced substantial growth in the number of flights in the last 2 years, and that's stayed steady at 10%.
Give or take. I think it's actually slightly higher.
Slightly higher. So to Mr. Buttel's statistics, the amount of lead has increased proportionate to the flights, the increase in number of flights that the airport is now generating, correct?
I'll let Dr.
Okay.
Patel answer that question. I'm not a scientist. I'm a pilot and a
So, and I'm just
airport
curious about,
director.
are we at capacity for flights, or is there still more room to grow? I assume that's what the expansion project's about. I mean, is there a number of flights we can have every day there? I mean, we're at a substantial increase. Is there room for more?
So there is. The way the FAA does it is your operations increase, they give you more people to handle it, they get you better equipment to handle it. I mean, obviously you look at DIA and they're continuing to grow, and the way they do it is the FAA handles it. There is a point where you get saturated, and where those flights, and someone operating a small piston engine aircraft may say, you know, I can go to Longmont, Front Range, these different airports,
Mhm.
and I don't have the wait times. I'm not told to hold. And so there is a point, but I don't think we're there yet.
So there is greater capacity for flights
I would
at
say
the
yes.
airport. Do you know what, I mean, we're at, what was the number? 260,
283.
is it 283 now? And what could we go up to at your current facility, and what your expansion?
That would be a question for air traffic control. Again, they manage the airspace, so they're the ones that are controlling all those aircraft. So I don't really have that answer.
Must have an idea.
I mean, Centennial's 300,000 plus, so I think we could match that.
Okay. And I'm not sure if I understood this correctly. The FAA is planning to transition by 2030, correct?
The
Roughly.
FAA is mandating that the airports transition by 2030.
And if I heard you correctly, you still have to, even if you do your transition, and since Centennial is trying to incentivize it too with that $4 million, you would still have to, you're still required by the FAA to provide leaded fuel through 2030 or whenever FAA mandates.
If the FAA reauthorization bill stands, as I've read the latest,
Mhm.
that would be the case. But again, until it passes and we get to read it, I don't have that answer.
Okay, presently, that would be the.
That would be the
You're
answer.
right now, if someone lands and needs leaded fuel, you're required to provide it,
That is correct.
correct? As long, so really in terms of whether there's leaded fuel at an airport or not is dependent on the FAA, not necessarily you.
That's a
Correct.
correct
That's correct. Okay, thank you. And I just wanted to ask Dr. Buttel a question, if I understood. If I could put in context the lead, you had a very vivid description of lead in the dust on the door, on the windowsills or on the windows. Can you put that in context for me in terms of lead paint or something else we might naturally be used to find lead in?
Sure. So with lead paint, I guess I should preface this in what capacity you're looking for, like how much we're seeing or the size of the lead paint. I guess to clarify your question, what type of
Normally,
quantification or
I live
metric?
16 miles away. I shouldn't have lead in my windowsill.
Yeah.
Because I'm 16 miles from an airport. But if I'm within 1.5 miles, I should anticipate that any dust that's collecting on my windows or around my house would contain a certain level of lead.
Correct. If you have
Comparable to if it was painted with lead paint.
I wouldn't say comparable, so that's a great question. So it would not be comparable to lead paint, but the way that the lead actually enters your body is much more significant compared to lead dust from lead paint. So lead dust from lead paint, it's like micron sized. particulate. And so when you actually inhale it, your body expels it pretty readily. The actual fear of lead paint comes from when your child crawls around the floor, goes up on the windowsill or touches the walls, and then eats something or puts something in their mouth and ingests the lead. And that is a much, much harder and much more difficult pathway for lead to enter your body compared to this lead particulate and lead dust on the windowsills. So you are going to find less lead on the windowsills compared to lead paint. However, the efficiency of it entering your body is much, much more significant and has a much lower threshold compared to lead. And so this comparison of these EPA and CDC standards of lead dust on these windowsills or on the walls compared to avgas particulate doesn't quite match up, because back in the day, when they went around and tested how much lead was in your air on your windowsills, they went and looked for these micron-sized particles rather than these 18 and smaller sized particles, and they did not affect you as much.
Okay, thank you very much. One last question. I'm not sure if you can answer it. Should have asked it earlier. I'm interested in terms of Erie Airport, because that's obviously closer to my area of town. I'm not sure what its traffic level is. What level of concern is that compared to Rocky Mountain?
I would have to go back and look at the numbers. I'm not 100% sure. There is the slide that does actually have Erie's numbers for fuel sales. However, those numbers aren't very accurate because they get a lot of their traffic from Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport going to Erie to do these touch and goes. So you actually want to look at the flight traffic itself compared to Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. So I'm happy to follow up with you and take a look at that.
You had a slide that had these numbers 500 and something and Erie was close to the Rocky Mountain number, correct?
So Erie had 9 times less fuel sold compared to Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. However, Erie doesn't necessarily sell a lot of fuel when you have a larger entity doing much of the selling, and when it gets congested, they go over there to do touch and go. So for example, on that spaghetti map, that density map, that heat map, those were flights that only came and started from Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. They did not come from anywhere else. They came and originated from Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. And you can see that Erie has those racetrack marks because pilots are going over there and training. So they get a lot more traffic compared to the avgas fuel sales. And to fully answer your question, I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. I will have to get back to you on that. Also, the reason why I don't show those numbers from the paper is that they kind of do it in an obscure way called percentile operations, which is based off of whatever they think is 100% of operations compared to 10% of operations. And so I would have to extract those numbers as well. So it's a little bit convoluted compared to the avgas.
So I'll just quote, do you think Erie Airport warrants the same kind of attention at Rocky Mountain?
I think more so for your district specifically. I think more so compared to Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. I don't want to throw Skystone and Stonegate under the bus, and other people who are a little bit north. I don't know your district as well, but they are further away. And Anthem Ranch seems like it's a fairly densely populated area as well, and they've had issues as well with crashes and things like that in the area. So it's definitely equal, if not a little bit more, in my opinion.
All right, thank you very much.
Perfectly honest answer.
Excuse me. Next is Councilmember Hinkle.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you all for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. I see some people who have served on, different counties. Thank you for being here, Commissioner Kraftharp and everyone. So it sounds like, I'm just going to kind of preface my questions with this. It sounds like we're advocating for the right thing and we're heading in the right direction together. It's just a matter of how quickly and how much it's going to cost. That's where I'm feeling here. I'm going to ask a question to Mr. Paul Anslow so I can give Dr. Butel a break here. And then I'll get back to you. I have done the airport tour twice now, and I've really appreciated you all doing that. It really magnifies the fact that we need it for our commerce, and we also need it for we have a pilot shortage too. So I really appreciate your work and making sure that we get pilots going. So I just wanted to flesh out a little bit more about what kinds of partnerships would we need with other airports? Do you see other airports moving quicker like you are? Because the issue that I have seen just in those tours is, okay, if we move forward, we also need partnerships with others to move forward so that our planes aren't just landlocked and they have to circle back and come back here. So are there other places moving quicker towards that 66%? Are you?
Hard to say, but I think an honest assessment is Centennial kicked it off. And again, they won the lottery, so why not? And then when that happened, it kind of spurred us to go, well, what can we do? And I believe every airport is looking at this and trying to figure out, and the industry, the flight schools, the manufacturers, the aircraft, the pilots, the fuel providers, the FBOs, like as an industry led by the FAA, this is all probably a top priority of all airports. I do believe that when we transition, it'll make other airports in the area say, okay, if they did it, and again, it's going to be pressure, right? Boulder's a small airport. I think they have 60,000 ops. Don't quote me on that. We have 280. They certainly don't have the budget we have, but if we transition over, then, like Council Member Cohen's like, hey, Boulder, why haven't you done it? And that pressure is going to apply to different airports. So I think holistically, airports are looking at this. I mean, I was looking at it for the last couple of years, but it's $1 million. It's a lot of money to do that. Centennial kicked it off, which again, to us, it was the key because now we have a fuel truck, a fuel distributor bringing fuel into the Denver metro area. Before that, it was $4 to $6 a gallon more to do that. So Centennial, and again, I don't know all their details, but they're subsidizing that cost to keep it low. But when we come in, I've talked to the Swift CEO, we think the fuel is going to be about $1.25, $1.30 more. So we've gone from between $4 and $6 down to $1.30. And as the next airport that comes in, because again, it's a quantity of scale, right? You have 5 airports. Now we can get the fuel that's either equal to or less than the leaded fuel. So I absolutely think in the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to see a massive switch at airports.
That's helpful to know because I think it's very important to kind of, you're not really necessarily taking a risk, but you're making sure that you're moving forward with what's going to be required anyway. And so I really appreciate that. So I'm wondering then if we have places like United, let's say, and they need more pilots, has there been any talk about a partnership with them saying, hey, would you help us subsidize, this effort? Have any private places said, hey, we're going to do this and brag about it, right? So I don't know if that's a way to recruit more pilots in that sense. I don't know.
So I think that's a great point. And I think that's as time goes on and we start getting this under our feet, I think that's maybe the next step of saying, hey, maybe we can make it go faster. I do know that our flight schools have partnered with airlines to get financing. So as a flight student, you can come in and get basically a bank account that you can fly your hours on, and then you get a guaranteed job. So there's partnerships that have already existed. But I think that's a great point, and I'll start looking into that as, what can we do next?
Yeah, it only seems like a win-win situation where you say, hey, we're going to give you some more pilots. We can do this together. But we also need your help in making sure that we provide unleaded fuel. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We're done with questions for right now. Let's see, Dr. Butel, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, better than my high school person, high school teachers.
I was a high school teacher. I was actually a biology teacher.
There you go.
So all of this brings back a lot of, I'll say a lot of trauma, I would imagine, for our Broomfield Council, because we have a lot of oil and gas extraction here, and we have gone up the ladder to the CDPHE. And so when you guys are describing that lead poisoning, we have talked with the CDPHE, do studies on the way that benzene, xylene, all of them are working synergistically in your body. And there's no studies on that either. And so we've been highly frustrated. So I feel those frustrations. So my question is, you mentioned that as lead accumulates, how does that work synergistically? Do we have more studies on that, on how it even works with maybe the benzene levels that are we testing those too? Because with fuel, it comes benzene, right? So we have those other issues. So
That's a very great question. I am not 100% sure on that. Lead, though, as a chemical, is not really catalytic, as far as I remember. I'll have to go back to my, undergraduate chemistry and all that stuff. So it's fairly inert in that sense. It's an ion. The only thing that it does do is because it interferes with the calcium pathways of your blood, it also kind of starts to replace the calcium in your bones as well. Think like fluoride. So this is the reason why it accumulates in your body and it's so hard to get rid of, is as it starts accumulating and depositing in your bones. Even if you walk away from the environment, you walk away, it starts to leach from your bones, and it takes a long time for it actually to fully expunge from your system, which is why it takes so long.
Interesting.
So I don't know about, the organic matter per se, but it does interact with other inorganic compounds in your body, such as calcium in your bones.
yeah, I'm wondering if it's the positive interaction with it not having its electrons.
It's like
Anyway.
soft acid-based chemistry, if I recall.
I'm kind of
The
wondering about
galvanic
that.
exchange kind of deal.
I wonder if it deals with oxygen too, because that's negatively based. And then would you go into a little bit more detail on how a person, you mentioned that if you want to get rid of the lead in your body, you have to have it chelated.
Mhm.
Is that just as simple as adding something to your body to help extract it? Or what does that process look like? And how can people get that paid for? Do they have to pay it for themselves?
That's a great question. So medical intervention so the medical community has kind of fallen behind a lot of these studies. So the medical community won't actually intervene until you hit about 5 micrograms per deciliter. That's just how the medical community looks at it. So when a child goes on in and says, hey, my child shows high levels of lead, I want you to take it out of their blood, the insurance company will say, no, they aren't at risk according to these documents. So they would have to pay out of pocket for that to happen. The process would be pretty simple and easy if the insurance companies would pay for it. Just a side note, for blood lead levels, the insurance companies will pay for it because you are nearby an airport and you are at risk. So that's as a side note. Blood testing should be free for most insurance companies. But the chelation process is simply you take some sort of ring, not a benzene ring per se, but some larger ring that basically hula hoops around the ion itself. And basically the body has a much easier way of processing that and getting rid of it. This is done for many heavy metal poisonings, for arsenic, copper, et cetera. It's a well-known process in the chemistry world, and it's very safe. The problem is getting someone to pay for it, because unless the insurance companies and the medical community say, this is really detrimental to your health, they'll say, you're fine, you can operate, you can live, but the science says you will have other detriments to that.
Okay. All right. So it sounds like it's kind of up in the air if they're actually able to get actual help. My last question is sort of a two-pronged question. So again, we've dealt with the CDPHE and we've asked for studies on that, and they just don't have the funding for it. So what are we doing to advocate for funding for that, for the CDPHE, first of all? Secondly, have we thought about, since we are going airport to airport, even outside of Colorado, can we partner with other studies with other states as well? What does that funding process look like? Is there a federal grant that we could have?
That's a great question, and I'm uncertain about the specifics of it. I know that since there is a lot of pressure on the CDPHE to actually look at this, but I do not know what the current state of that is or what grants are available there. I think that's a great thing to look into, whether it be federal grants or whether it be just Colorado grants in general to look into it. I think that's a great idea, but I cannot comment on it because I'm not 100% versed in that area.
Yeah, and the CDPHE generally likes to do things at home so that we can test our own winds and our own everything. So my time is up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next is Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to start off first with Mr. Anzo. So my first question is going to be about the STCs. Who actually administers and certifies that? Is that the aircraft manufacturer? Is that the FAA? Is that a certified mechanic in combination? Can you just kind of go over that process?
So
And
that's
how
an-
long does that process take?
I don't know how long the process takes. I think it's 30 days, but that is an FAA. So you would send all the data to the FAA. They would look at it and say, yep, your aircraft meets this requirement. They send you the placard, they send you the pilot handbook page. You slip the page into your handbook and you attach the placard.
Okay, and would that be done locally at, let's say, the Rocky Mount Metropolitan Airport, or would they have to go somewhere else and get that done?
It could be done right at Rocky Mountain Metro Airport or any airport, really.
Okay, wonderful. I want to ask you about the percentage of general aviation versus, I guess, commercial activity. So regularly scheduled planes, the private aircraft that are coming in on charters, et cetera. What is the percentage of flight traffic that occurs at Rocky Mount Metropolitan Airport for flight schools and general aviation versus commercial activity?
So it's very hard to tell because the FAA doesn't sit there and say, oh, that's a flight school plane. Oh, that's personally owned. That's a business plane. But working with the air traffic control tower, working with my staff, doing the analytics, flight schools and small GA makes up about 60 to 67% of our operations.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted clarification on that because earlier you had said 10% of fuel is
So fuel and operations are
fuel,
different.
but I wanted to make sure you were clarifying that operations was very different than
And
sales
the
of
reason
fuel.
why those numbers are different is because a small piston aircraft will burn 8 gallons an hour. Commercial airliner will burn, 800 an hour or whatever. So the fuel is 10%, and that's just off of our fuel sales. You look at the two different types and you go, okay, that's 10%. But our operations are, and again, an operations is a takeoff or landing, a touch and go, which is a airplane touches down, continues on, and then takes off, is counted as 2 operations. So that's a takeoff and landing. So a jet aircraft, let's say JSX, which is our commercial service provider, lands, picks up passengers and departs. A small training aircraft may do 6 times, 7 times, 10 times around the pattern. That's why the operational numbers are different.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure we had that clarification for everyone. And then my last question I think that I have for you is, can you go a little bit more into the landing fees in terms of why exactly those rules are in place that prohibit you from charging a landing fee for aircraft under 12,000 X pounds and so on and so forth?
So that's not a rule, it's a standard industry practice. And again, the reason being is the reason landing fees are initiated are not to limit operations, which is what everybody who wants me to do landing fees really wants. And the FAA prohibits. So with the comments that were made tonight, with the letters that we received from the congressman that say you need to do it to limit operations, the FAA is going to say you can't do it because that's access. So FAA requires safety first, access to the airspace second. So it's not a rule that says I can, it's an industry practice. And the reason we do that is because it's based on damage to your runway. So a 2,000-pound Cessna could land 1,000,000 times and probably do 0 damage to our runway, but a heavier aircraft starts wearing out the asphalt. So that's why those sort of guidelines, not rules, are in place.
All right, thank you for that clarification. Dr. Patel, I have a few questions for you. The first one is going to be on the slide that you mentioned some of the preventative measures people can take to limit exposure. One of them you said was use AC instead of having your windows open, et cetera. Are the filters in people's HVAC systems for their homes capable of filtering out that lead particulate matter?
That's a great question. The answer is no. So the best HEPA filter on the market, which when I first found out about leaded fuel, I ran out and bought, came from Blue Air. They filter down to about 100 nanometers in size. However, these particles are much smaller in size. So the HEPA filter won't do as much as you're hoping. It will do some, but it won't do as much. But my understanding is that AC circulates air in your home. I'm not an HVAC tech, But the idea is you're not bringing in hot air from outside and basically and putting it inside, but you are recycling it. So you don't want to bring outside air inside where these nanoparticulate come from. You want to kind of close up, not hermetically seal, because you'll lose oxygen at some point, but seal up as much as possible to prevent this dust from coming inside and cooling your house that way.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. How long does lead particulate matter actually stay in the air? So you mentioned trying to mitigate as much of your outside activity during heavy usage periods of air traffic flight instead of maybe early in the morning or later at night, maybe not for this particular airport, but just as an example.
Yeah. Another great question. So it really depends upon weather. So obviously if you have a high wind day, it probably won't stick around very much. If you have a calm day or an inversion layer, which will basically kind of seal everything on and the pollution in very much and kind of circulate it around, it can last, some studies show it can last up to days. That's an extreme case in that sense, but it really will depend upon the weather. Is it going to rain? What are the winds? Things like that. So hopefully the idea is that some wind would come across at some point to blow it away. So you can, after the planes die down, you can go out and play and do what you can. But that won't always be the case.
Okay, thank you. And then I think this will be my final question. Councilmember Delgadillo touched on this for older adults, but for anyone over the age of, let's say, 18, what are the effects for people exposed to leaded aviation fuel? Because where I live in the Interlochen area, it's a bunch of apartments, so it's typically younger adults, single, not traditionally many kids, but I do live within that ring of what some people call the racetrack. So I just want to understand, what are those effects for younger adults or even people middle-aged?
Yeah, so great question. So like I said, the most affected are children because it affects the brain, the calcium pathways in the brain. For once you start getting older, it starts having other effects. So it's been linked to heart disease, hypertension, cognitive effects as well. However, you need to hit a little bit of higher lead levels. However, if you're in the area long enough, that can happen. A resident over in Green Knolls area tested as high as 3.5 micrograms per deciliter, and their doctors were very shocked and astounded, and that's not a healthy level. And she's in her up in the upper age.
Okay. Have there been studies that have shown what that length of period for exposure has to be before you really start seeing those, let's say, cognitive issues, those physical issues with hypertension or heart disease and dementia, et cetera? Or have we not, or is there not enough scientific evidence yet to show kind of what the minimum, quote unquote?
So for heart disease and the brain issues for older adults, I'm not familiar with those enough with those studies to really say yes, like this is the threshold you should be looking for. I would just say consult your doctor would be the best option. That goes a little bit beyond my knowledge, and I don't feel comfortable in making a fair assessment on that. The idea for children is once you hit 1 microgram or below, that's where you start hitting the noise level that scientists cannot pull any correlation below 1 microgram. That's why tests for blood oftentimes say less than 1 microgram per deciliter, you're fine. But once you go above that, things start getting, you can have health effects, but talk to your doctor.
All right, thank you. Those are all my questions, Mayor.
Thank you. Councilmember Marsh-Holshan.
Thank you, Mayor. Question for Dr. Patel first, since you were already up. Sorry.
Good. I need my exercise.
Some questions related to the Reed-Hillview study that you presented to us. You mentioned that they didn't find any increased lead in the soil. Is that correct?
Correct.
But you are recommending not to eat fruits and vegetables?
Correct.
Okay, I just kind of curious of the correlation between those two. And then kind of my extended question on that is, we heard that this is going to be ended by 2030 nationwide. How long does it I know you're saying most of it's coming from inhalation, But how long will it remain in the soil after we stop using it?
Great questions. So to go back to answer the soil for vegetables and fruits, that came from recommendation from California. And their main issue was that if it coats the fruit, then you could ingest it. And just like the windowsills where you have a surface where it can land on and therefore concentrate on, if you don't wash it properly, you can eat it and it can affect you. For the soil, the plants are very, very good at getting the minerals from the soil. I don't know exactly at what level it would be considered dangerous. Probably for the root vegetables, you're probably okay. You're not going to be at a level that the EPA says the soil is contaminated from that. It's more the deposition and the inhalation, which makes it so much more dangerous. And could you remind me of your second question? Because I have a short-term memory sometimes.
It was kind of related to how long will it remain in this, like, once we finish using this completely.
Yep.
How long will it still be in the soil? It could be dangerous in the soil, I guess.
Yeah. So once it's in the soil, it's not going to go away. It could be blown away with high winds if it's on the top layer of soil. But what oftentimes happens is that plant particulate, plant matter kind of grows on top and it gets incorporated into the soil as well. So it's not going to go away per se. But that being said, if you're worried about soil level contamination, if you, for the EPA per se, if you look at the, I did a calculation once. If you look at the 1.25 ton that's emitted across the entire Boulder area, if you look at a 4-mile radius and say, let's just assume that all the lead just lands right there. It would take about 100 years before the EPA will say, oh, this land is contaminated and therefore we have a problem. So the lead, once it gets into the ground, is a little bit safer as long as you don't kick it up and you get and inhale it. But it's the fact that it is so small and it can penetrate the lungs that makes it so dangerous.
Okay. And then related to the study, you mentioned the study ranges from 5 to 35,000. I'm assuming that's gallons per month.
Correct. 5 to 35,000.
And you listed our MMA as 45,000 and change. But then we heard from Mr. Anselo that the difference between 10% of the sales versus 60% of the operations. I guess my question is, do we have the data from this study to know their makeup of sales versus operations, and also so we can make a comparison? And also, was that 45,000 that you listed from RMMA, was that just the leaded fuel that they sell, or was it also included the 90% of it, the fuel sold, which is the jet fuel?
Great question. So that was, I was just looking at amount of fuel sold at Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. And it doesn't matter, and this is a point that needs to be made very clear. It doesn't matter what percentile of fuel is sold at the airport. It could be 1%, it could be 90% of avgas is sold at the airport. It's the amount that is sold at the airport, which is a problem. So even if, you know, Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport says, I'm going to stop increasing, or somehow could wave a magic wand and say, we're not going to increase any more operations or sell any more fuel and just focus on commercial and Jet A, you're still going to have the same amount of lead dumped on you day after day. So so that's the kind of the way you have to reconcile it. It's the amount sold. Now to compare to the Reed Hillview airport, that airport, if I recall, is a much smaller airport. They don't have as much commercial there, if commercial at all. So they're mainly made up of piston aircrafts there, and they have about 30% less operations per year compared to Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. For example, at the height of the height of operations during the Reed Hillview study, which is over 10 years, the maximum operations per year was 180,000 operations per year. And we're at 262,000 operations per year at Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport, significantly higher comparatively. And it went down to, I think the low was about 110,000 operations per year. So it varied from year to year.
Okay, thank you. That's all the question I had for you. From Mr. Anselo, I had a few questions. I want to thank you for coming tonight and explaining the steps that you're taking to take care of this issue, even in advance of what the FAA is requiring you to. And I think that's very important, especially that you're buying your own truck and buying your own tank, which just to make note of that, you mentioned that the operators are kind of in a wait and see approach because of the demand. And I'll just point out that the market often does a very bad job of spending money to mitigate health risks without prompting from regulation. So I appreciate you doing that. And I guess my question is, my first question, how many airplanes do you have that use the leaded fuel? I know you said 10% have sold, but obviously that's different with
So out of, and I don't have the number in front of me, but we have roughly 400 aircraft based. Probably a good 350 of those are piston aircraft.
So the amount, most of your tanks and trucks you have are for the leaded fuel.
No. Sorry, all of them are for leaded fuel. Sorry, it's a long night. The piston aircraft, their tanks use leaded fuel, so they have that. Most of our fuel is Jet A, which is used in turbine aircraft, commercial, corporate aircraft. And again, go back to the analogy of if you go fly a Cessna 152 for an hour, you burn 7 gallons. A Gulfstream 5 will burn, that much in about 3 minutes. So the bigger tanks and the more fuel that we sell is actually Jet A.
That makes sense. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm neither an expert in aviation or science, so I'm a lawyer. So, yeah.
Thanks, Dan.
So I think I can. You're getting this one tank in advance of 2030 when you're going to have it all. Do you have an estimate of how you said right now 10%, 60% of operations is, do you have an estimate of a year by year of how that's going to decline as you start selling more and transitioning?
I think right or wrong, that's going to be market based. The flight schools have committed to work with the FBOs, the airport and the flight schools so that we can come up to a working solution. But again, when the gas is $1 more a gallon, it's like if you can go to Walmart and get it, or Costco, whoever sells fuel, and get it for $1 cheaper, you're not going to go to Exxon or, I think it's market based. Again, because the industry is so focused on this transition. And as the production ramps up, and Swift and GAMI have been the leaders, but there are multiple other companies that are now sort of going, this is coming, and it's coming right around the corner. So I see it's going to start off not slowly, but moderately. And then in the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to see a massive transition. And again, my own personal belief is we're going to be fully transitioned, not only Rocky Mountain, but basically, 90% of the airports that can afford it in the next 2 to 3 years.
Forgive my ignorance of the industry, but there's the 94 and the 100. I'm assuming that's the same as like 85, whatever fuel for a car.
Yes, it's the octane.
And it seems like for cars, it's pretty well established and regulated that there's a set, standard that we have. Is that true in the aviation industry where there's a set like octanes or?
It is. So there's actually a 90 octane out there that can be used. The problem with that, at least for Colorado, is our altitude. So as that fuel becomes less effective, it doesn't really work in our market. The 94 has been approved, and it's all about the horsepower and the style of your engine. The more powerful engines aren't able to. So think about if you have a BMW or a Mercedes, if you open up your fuel tank, it says use 99 octane or 100 octane, whatever they. Whereas if like me, I drive a Dodge, you can put the cheap stuff in. Same thing. The airplanes are specific.
I guess that's my follow-up. I can go to a Chevron station or a Conoco station or whatever station, put gas in my car, and my car's running just fine. Is there a way, has the industry regulated to a point where you could put 100 Swift versus 100 the other company, where those are interchangeable, so you don't have the expense of switching out the tanks?
So the 100, which will be marketable and really available in 2 to 3 years, it just got approved in September of 2022, will fit any piston aircraft. So they've been approved, and it's a long process. The FAA has to go through all these engine testings and say, we are satisfied that this fuel will work in these planes. The 94 UL, which is I won't say readily available, but more available, only fits about 66-67% of the fleet, because those other ones have engine problems when you start using them. So the FAA regulates it. They have approved the 94 and the 100, but for specific engine types and engine powers.
So I couldn't, if I owned a plane that worked for the 94 UL, I couldn't use 94 UL today and 100 UL tomorrow in the same plane. Like I could with my car, I guess is the question.
As I understand it, and I'm not a fuel expert, I just, I do the best I can. The 100 is what they call a drop-in. So you could use, so let's say you took off from my airport and you filled up with 94 UL in 2024. You could fly out to Kansas, and if they decided to use 100, you could actually use that fuel and then return. So you can go back and forth with those two fuels, as long as you have the certificate from the FAA saying you are allowed to use that, specific fuel.
And then is that a separate certificate?
It
for
is a
each time?
separate,
Okay.
yeah, it's a separate STC.
That's all good to know. One kind of follow-up question for you. I know it's expensive as a transition, but it seems like the issue is the operators wanting to use it and then the gas being available. So if you, as an airport, had the money available, somebody wrote you a check, you got a grant, whatever, you could make the transition a lot quicker.
I think we're doing it as fast as we can.
Like Centennial's done.
Yeah.
with- okay.
I mean, we're a year behind them. So I think even without somebody writing me a check, we're doing that transition. Ultimately, as that price comes down, more planes are using it. Both the distribution, the refinement, and ultimately the FBOs doing the investment in their own infrastructure, because eventually everyone knows that the leaded fuel is going away. So there's going to be a point where the market says to an FBO, hey, we're actually selling more of the unleaded. Let's go ahead and diminish our leaded fuel.
Okay.
So I think we're going as fast as we can. And I would love if you guys wanted to cut me a check, I'll buy a second truck. But I think with the decisions that we've made, we're going as fast as we can.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. I have one question for our staff, actually. Do we have right now, if somebody buys a home in the airport area, do they have a notice in their title documents that they're living in a flight area? Is that a question for you, I guess?
That's probably a question for
Okay.
me. Again, I'm not a real estate expert, but we have what in the industry we call avigation agreements for basically everywhere in the affected area. We call it the airport influence area, and those are in your closing documents. What we've been told and what we've actually tried to push with the realtors is that should be up front. Instead, people don't know about it till they get to their closing day. And, if you've ever closed on a house, it's, 3 inches thick and you're just, you're signing. And you may see it and they're like, oh yeah, that's just saying there's an airport nearby. You sign it and you move on.
Do those notices include the warning about the lead?
They do not.
Okay. And then one last question for our staff. Could we, like we did with oil and gas operations, could we mandate a notice for purchases and leaseries that they are in a lead area?
We could, council member, and similar to the discussions that we've had on other notifications, we do have the challenge of monitoring and the enforcement that goes with those notifications. But yes, that is a possibility.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you. First, I want to apologize to James over here. Lawyers have more utility at least than stockbrokers and hedge fund managers.
You're a lawyer too.
I'm kidding. Dr. Boutel, I just want to thank you for your presentation today. No questions. I just appreciate you bringing this alarming information to our attention and to the community's attention. And Mr. Anslow, no questions for you either. I do appreciate number one, the economic benefits that the airport does bring to Broomfield. And also appreciate the steps that you outlined today that the airport is taking to reduce the use of AV gas going forward. So the only question that I had was really kind of a staff one, and my colleague here kind of answered it a little bit for me, but the question was really now what? This has been informational today. But it's my understanding we do have very little authority over the airport operations itself. So outside of a notification that was just brought up, I was just curious as to, and I'm not saying we wanted to do anything or if we do or don't. I was just kind of curious as to if this is just an informational study, session today, or if there was some sort of call to action that we needed to discuss. Because this has been interesting. I enjoy it, but I'm also here to do a job and I'm not sure if there's something we should be considering.
Well, I think a lot has happened in the last few weeks with the EPA having the endangerment finding with the leaded fuel and the FAA reauthorization and the trend to move away from the leaded fuel with the FAA.
No, yeah,
reauthorization.
I get all that and I get the studies. It's more of a what can we do question because we don't have, we have very little authority on this. It's my understanding. So
Yeah.
this is fun to listen to, but I'm just curious as to why we're doing this
Public
as a body.
information.
No, that was my question, right?
If I may, first and foremost, I will say of all the municipalities that we work with, yours is the best. You do the referrals to us about building in the airport influence area, and some municipalities don't. I would support, and we've said this publicly at the CNR and other meetings, notification and navigation agreements, and I would say add lead. Because what that does is inform the public. So if you buy a house, then you're not all of a sudden surprised and say, oh, well, where's the airport? Why is it? So we would support that wholeheartedly. And if you could make that happen, I think it would be a benefit to everybody.
I appreciate that guidance, and that does answer my question a little bit as sort of a, what can we do type of thing. So yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Patty, Ms. Sullivan, we're out. We're not taking public comment on this. Thank you. Okay, you can email us. Next is Councilmember Schaaf.
Well, it's good to see you all. Normally I see you once a month and at the RMMA Community Noise Roundtable. But just a note, we will not have our Community Noise Roundtable in October. So just trying to get the word out there as much as I can. I had talked to our congressional leaders and talked about that this is really kind of a cash for clunkers kind of program, and that really if they infuse enough money to certify all of these planes and build the infrastructure, that we can make this transition a lot quicker, and that they did that with the Cash for Clunkers program, and they could very well do it for this as well. However, the House of Representatives mandated leaded gas sales indefinitely. We'll see how it all works out with the Senate version, but that's disappointing. So I'm separating noise issues from the leaded issues, just as I have as the chair of the RMMA CNR. It sounds like there's concern from Jefferson County, from RMMA, even 3 of the flight schools. But the issue to make this transition happen quicker is both comes down to resources as well as the speed at which the planes can be certified. So you had already covered the suggestion of utilization of landing fees. And just a note, I don't think the consultant with ABC ×2 recommended landing fees. And I know for certainty that HMMH did not recommend landing fees. So a couple questions. One of them has to do with the press conference that is tomorrow. And I'm wondering if you can give us a preview of that announcement, because I believe it deals with this subject matter.
It does. So we're very excited to have a press conference tomorrow morning at the airport. Everybody's invited at 10 o'clock in the morning. And we're going to have a press conference with our truck sitting there, and also make the announcement that we're making the investment into a tank to try to speed that transition up and actually begin selling fuel in 2024. That's the unleaded fuel in 2024.
Great. Thank you for that. So with the FAA grants and monies that are coming in for 2024, is there a possibility that some of that money can be utilized for the infrastructure for unleaded gas?
It is. So we meet with the FAA regularly, as you know. Our official CIP meeting is Thursday, where we'll actually rack and stack. But we've actually addressed that with the FAA and said, look, we want to move this up to a priority, and we're going to do that. So they're going to be able to provide some money to put into the tank, and the fuel truck has already been purchased through our own budget process. But the tank, which is the installation and buying of the tank, which is the more expensive, we're going to need FAA funds.
Okay, so when we're talking, you had mentioned that kind of $4 million figure. Is that going to cover the infrastructure that's going to be needed for unleaded fuel sales, or is there additional monies that's going to be needed?
I'm not sure I used 4 million. I think I used 1 million, but if I did, I misspoke, but that's fine. That will get us started. Again, we have 2 FBOs. We're buying 1 truck and one tank to get us started. What I've talked with the FBOs and what I've talked with the flight schools is let's get it in there. We'll work out the details. Again, once that starts and that transition starts, then it becomes market-based where they go, oh, there's a demand. We're actually using more of the unleaded 94 than we are of the leaded current avgas. And so then it becomes market-based, and then the FBOs can say, hey, this is an investment. And I don't know about both FBOs, but there are multiple tanks selling or storing av fuel. So they could, and theoretically, look at it and go, you know, it makes more sense with us now that there's a market base and we can actually look at the numbers to transition one of those tanks or more. And so ultimately, we think in 2024 we'll begin, and in 2025, actually both FBOs will begin servicing instead of just the one using our tank and our truck.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is kind of a technical question, but it's more just because of the Broomfield jurisdiction. So with the Crosswinds Airport runway that creates a lot of traffic for a significant part of Ward 3 in Broomfield, there is a plan to close that runway. Is that correct?
I would say that's correct, except for a lot of traffic.
Sorry. There is a lot of traffic that goes from that runway over Broomfield, in particular Ward 3, which
when it's in operation, yes,
exactly.
Which is less than 1% of our time, but yes.
Correct. So what is the timing of that closure of that runway? Do we have a timeline for that?
We don't. Our engineers have looked at it and said that runway will fail in about 2 years. The promise I made to the general aviation community, who are really the users because it's such a small runway, and the commissioners, is I won't close it until I have to. And ultimately that'll be based on, you know, is it failing on its own, or do I have a development or a prospect to develop in that area? So I would shut it down and then build hangars or build an FBO or build a terminal. Again, I don't have those, you know, in my pocket right now. So we don't have a timeline, but I would say probably no longer than 2 years. It'll be closed from basically it failing, and possibly early, depending on what, you know, what businesses come to me and say, hey, we'd like to develop on that runway.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Ansel. I have one question for Dr. Patel. You mentioned that there wasn't a response to the letter from the doctors to Jefferson County, or there was a response from Jefferson County. Was there a response from CDPHE regarding that letter of conducting a thorough study of lead levels in both the air and soil?
So to clarify, I don't think any letter has been sent out to CDPHE from any official of authority. The letter just said to ask Jeffco and surrounding people to initiate it with Colorado Department of Public Health, because they don't have the ability to do that. Basically, a government official or someone needs to go out and actually activate them themselves, is my understanding. I'm not 100% sure of what that whole process looks like. But definitely, I do recommend looking into it. It's definitely good for your citizens to at least know how much the airport is affecting them, and to make their choices based off of that.
Okay, but to your knowledge, CDPHE has not, of course, conducted a thorough study of lead levels in both the air and soil.
Correct. But I do recommend that that's something you should pursue.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Thank you. That's my question for you. It seems that, you know, Broomfield could follow Boulder County's lead, send a letter to the EPA and supporting the environmental protection agencies, proposed finding that leaded aviation gas endangers public health and welfare. I think that is an additional step that maybe we could take. So, Mayor, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Anderson.
All right, thank you. Okay, I guess I'll start with my question for Dr. Patel. Do you know if exposure to lead in utero causes any harm to the developing fetus? Does that cross the?
So that's a great question. The answer is yes. That's something I forgot to bring up. But expecting mothers, the child in the womb is going to be greatly affected by it, because they are trying to, again, develop the brain, develop their system, and you're looking at a smaller vessel exposed to the same, I guess a larger vessel, but they are themselves pretty small. They basically, yes, the answer is yes, they are going to be affected to basically the same degree as toddlers and children under the age of 2.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate all the previous answers and the understanding of just how dangerous this is to the community. So that's all the questions I have for you, but I want to make a comment in response to the request to potentially put a notice to future home buyers. This is for residents who purchase homes before understanding just how dangerous the lead levels were. And this is not this information apparently is not in those abrogation agreements, that this kind of puts the onus on the wrong party. That we need to kind of think of something a little bit different here, because that doesn't seem like the right direction to go. I do have a couple of questions to you, Director Anslow. Let's see. Okay, from your perspective, are the pilots and flight school operators, do they share this concern about the lead fuel? Do they understand that this is coming from their planes and the harm it's doing to the community?
Yes, I would.
General feeling.
Yes, the whole industry is aware of it. Again, there was nothing really anybody could do until that process that I talked about in my presentation about getting the fuel approved. And now the whole industry is moving towards that. So yes, everyone is aware.
Pushback at all. You're seeing a move that they're moving in this direction.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's good to know. And then you talked about the wrong fuel type going into the planes that they tops them off. Is there anything stopping a flight school from like putting like a red X or something on their outside of their planes? Just say, hey, don't put it in. I mean, it seems like it should be really easy to solve.
You would have to get that approved by the FAA, and they don't approve, red X's on airplanes. Because it would be confusing to people. What's that red X? It's a real possibility, but it's not a high possibility. But there is, again, when you look at two planes side by side, they're exactly the same. The only way you as a refueler, and again, they refuel 24 hours a day. So it could be midnight, could be 2 o'clock in the morning. You're 18 years old. You got a final exam tomorrow, and you go to a plane and you don't look at the placard and you put the wrong fuel in. So it is a possibility.
Thank you. I'm just glad that we're moving in this right direction. Thank you. That's all the questions I have. I just have one question for our Deputy City and County Manager. I think you could probably answer this one. Have we begun these discussions with the Erie Airport, or is that something we should soon undertake?
We have, I'm unaware, we haven't had those conversations with Erie. Doesn't mean that we can't. But I don't know of any. Do they have an FBO over there, Paul?
They do.
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of one of those things, bark and driven. I mean, biggest thing is getting Jeffco to move in the direction they are. And like Director Anslow said, that will put pressure on the surrounding airports to do the same, because Councilmember Cohen's going to go over there and he's going to say, hey, Jeffco's doing this, what the heck? And I think that's where we'll get the pressure in there, but certainly something that we can look at when we talk to them.
Yeah, and I think, and you had noted something about the Anthem population, and there is, just looking at Anthem Ranch, almost everyone within Anthem Ranch, the top third is within a half mile, and almost the entirety of Anthem Ranch is within 1.5 miles of the Erie Airport. So that almost becomes like a greater concern, especially considering this is another 55 and up community. So I don't know. I guess that's just a comment. Anyways, thank you for your time, and glad we're having this discussion, although it doesn't make me feel too happy right now. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, before we go to second round, I do have a couple of questions, and I'll start with you, Dr. Boutel. So I serve on the State Board of Health representing CD7. So I was copied on an email from some impacted residents to Director Ryan because there was an article published that they were going to do an analysis on lead in children. So I don't know if you've heard anything about this, but the email from Director Ryan said that they have subject matter experts. They're conducting an analysis and will submit it for peer review. We expect this work to be completed by the end of the year. This was in May, but it will be contingent on peer review. So I'm just curious if I need to like poke into that, because we were told that that is ongoing.
So it's part of the process, the scientific process. And if it's going to peer review, that's great. Basically, it gives the highest, if it gets past peer review, that's the highest stamp science can really give on it. That means that the authors stand behind it, the reviewers stand behind it, and editors stand behind it. The scientific community stands behind it. So you could always poke them and be like, hey, where is this at? Is it hitting a snag? Because people are kind of just like the EPA endangerment finding, are anxiously awaiting this. But the scientists, if they're going to follow a process that they're going to try to make sure the data looks is good, is correct. It's just maybe good for your just to notify your community, be like, hey, I did reach out. Here's where they're at. Again, they're still on track for the end of the year. But that's really good to know. Thank you for
I'll
sharing that.
follow up and I'll keep you guys in the loop as well. And I just have one question for you, Mr. Anslow. Thank you, Dr. Patel. I noted that you said that touch and goes, they count as a takeoff and a landing, so they count as two operations. But isn't that how they get around violating the 500-foot rule because it's considered the same flight?
No, ma'am. So the FAA rule says you have to be 1,000 feet when you're basically flying above populated areas. But when you're in the landing configuration, so for airports, we say out to 5 miles, you start preparing for landing. So you can be below 1,000 feet out 5 miles out on your way into a landing and you're completely within the rules.
Okay, so there's a radius that permits that. It looks really annoying on the map. Thank you. We'll go around to a second round, and I do appreciate you both being here and for the latest, greatest information hot off the press. Excited to hear about the news moving forward at the press conference. So we'll go back to Councilmember Lim.
Yes, there was one next step that I didn't think we'd addressed. I guess this would be to ask staff. So there was an education component that for those in the impacted areas with the heat map. So as we're moving in the right direction, that's going to take a little time. Is there a possibility of looking at the mitigation steps for individuals and making that public, providing that communication to the public, especially in the impacted areas? Can the staff address that?
Well, our public health director
Yes, he
happens
is.
to be here. Mr. Volling, would you like to come to the podium?
Yeah, excellent question, Councilmember Lim, and sorry, I'm losing my voice, so I'm not infectious anymore, but it's a carryover from before. We have started an education program specifically looking at healthy homes. So when you look at lead exposure, again, we're talking about paints and everything else. We want our residents to know, here's the potential risk of being exposed to lead. The second thing that we have been doing is provider outreach. So for looking at testing, so that's something we can build into public health. It's not a significant cost for us to do education around lead and to get tested. I would say the second thing, I just want this body to know, primarily the role of local public health is once we have a reportable condition from a provider, we do a follow-up epidemiology investigation to see what are those causes behind it. And so I was asking our team, and I need to go back and look at the data. I don't think we've had any reportable conditions over the past 5 years. And that could be due to lack of awareness for testing, or it could be due to the fact that we're not seeing elevated blood levels. So stuff that we just need to dive into a little bit deeper.
Next is Councilmember Ward.
Thank you, Mayor. Some of my colleagues up here have mentioned the need for notification for home purchasers as well as renters. Obviously can't speak to purchasing a home because probably never will be able to do that in my life. But in terms of renters, because I do live in the Interlochen area and I've lived 2 different apartment complexes, both have required me and quite poignantly required me to sign a specific piece of paper that acknowledges I live within an airport, one in particular says, please don't, you can't sue us if a plane hits your apartment. But they do make that quite apparent when you're signing your lease documents, at least for the two that I have rented at. I do agree. I think we should have some added notification of lead aviation poison, lead aviation fuel in the area and the health impacts that are associated with such exposure. And then Councilmember Lim stole the other comment I was going to make. I do have one other question for Mr. Anslow. I'm gonna make sure you get your steps in tonight. The last question I have kind of follows up with what Councilmember Schaff had asked earlier is, you mentioned the timeline for transitioning to unleaded aviation fuel, and part of that is money, and I think you said roughly 26 might be the earliest you could anticipate.
If we're talking about our airport, yes, again, every airport's different, but yes, fully transitioned.
Okay. How much equipment does fully transitioned look like? And what is that total cost?
So to fully transition, again, it's economy of scale, right? But if you think we have two FBOs, we need at least 2 tanks and 2 trucks to deliver the fuel. So the airport is purchasing one of each, and then we will lease that to one of the FBOs. We're in negotiations with those 2 FBOs right now to say, hey, we're getting it. Which one of you, money talks, right? Who wants to have that flight? The good news is we have the flight schools who are signed on. So there's already a built-in demand. So we believe that the next tank, which again is about $1 million with the tank, and we got our truck for 50,000 because it was a used truck. It's actually a 1984 truck from another airport. But I have the best mechanics in the country and they're going to keep that thing running. A new truck is up around 200,000. So the next FBO that doesn't lease one from us will eventually have to buy or convert. Again, remember when the demand kind of becomes more where the unleaded fuel becomes greater than the unleaded, they could take an existing tank, an existing truck, go through a cleansing process, and then it'd be ready to do. So I would say on the low end, to include the purchase of our truck and tank, if we did it for both FBOs, would be somewhere between 2 million and 4 million. And maybe that's where you got the number from, Devin. I apologize.
All right. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure I had that math correct in my head. That's it, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Marshallson.
Thank you, Mayor. Actually, just had a follow-up question. How much does it cost to convert a tank in a truck?
To be honest, I don't know. I could check with Centennial and figure out what they paid. It's fairly minimum. I talked to the Swift CEO and GAMI CEO, and they basically say you drain it, you flush it out with some cleaning fluid that's non-biodegradable to fuel and doesn't impact the fuel. And so because it's the government, my guess is it's probably close to $50,000, but that's just a guess.
Okay, thank you. And then going off of my previous comments and also Councilmember Ward's previous comment, I was wondering if we could maybe take a straw poll of the sense of council if we wanted to direct staff tonight, so we don't have to have another study session. If we wanted to direct staff tonight to work up an ordinance that would require notification, a lead notification and safety notification for not only home buyers, but also leasees. And that would be presented at the beginning of the process rather than the end. So
an informed consent that
yeah,
might be exposed.
similar to what we did with the plugged into
Oil and
wells.
gas,
Yeah.
right? Everybody clear on the request? Opposed to that? Okay, so yeah, it looks like you have support for that. Okay, thank you. Thank you for bringing that forward.
Thank you, Mayor. That's all.
All right. Next is Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you. Okay, so a comment regarding that notification. And this is why there's that whole enforcement piece. You're putting the note that you're putting the onus on the wrong party. That's what came out of comments after we did the oil and gas setbacks. There was some frustration. We know the exact area. Why not just put out a map and start doing the public education component? That's what I would say. Make it really super easy and just notify all the people living there, regardless of whether you sell your house or not. You're living in this area and you should get tested. I don't see the benefit to throwing this into the documents. But so my question is for Director Valling. And it's a follow-up to Councilmember Lim's question in your response. And you stated about the reportable condition. And I'd love to hear more about that. Like if we had enough public education and people knew that they live within a certain distance of the airport, they can get free blood testing. And we started, and you started to see some levels that were above a certain level. Is that a requirement that the doctors have to report? Or can you explain that report?
Yeah, so to clarify, it's not free testing. The doctor here talked about all of the aspects of having a provider actually do the test based on insurance and everything. My understanding is Medicaid does reimburse for testing, so that's part of our provider outreach. But then secondly, if there is elevated blood levels above the thresholds, that's when it becomes a reportable condition, similar to COVID. When we get alerted as a local public health agency, you have this individual elevated blood levels, and then we follow up with our epi investigation.
Okay, so above, do you know what that level is? Is it similar to what we were talking, the levels we were talking about earlier? Do we know what that?
I can get that back to you. Yeah, I don't have them in front of me right now.
That'd be great to know if that's something with what we're kind of seeing in the airport area and what we're seeing there. And then, yeah, just knowing that if we have enough people testing, okay, so you'd have to do it through your own insurance and then pay your copay or whatever, get that test. Some
So
people would be free. So, okay, but when,
So-
if you,
yeah, so as a resident, you would not want to know your potential risk. And then it'd be a conversation with your healthcare provider and the healthcare provider and your decision of whether or not it's appropriate to test. Based on that test, based on risk, then the determination, do you have an elevated level? And if it's above that reportable condition, then that's when we do follow up. But the education piece is stuff that we can definitely take on.
yeah, I appreciate the focus on the education and hopefully getting some people out to get blood tested and to really know if we are seeing those levels. Thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Cohen.
I'll be quick. I think I'd say ditto to Councilmember Anderson in the sense that signing title papers and is a poor vehicle for public education or notification if certain water tank project gives us any lesson. To that end, for Director Volley, I don't know if the public or health board has discussed this, or to Councilmember Marsh-Holson, maybe the opposite approach is to direct council staff to develop some sort of public education program where people within the 1.5 mile zone, or especially daycares and schools. I don't think there's any schools within the RMMA area, but there are daycares. In an area, I think there is a school within that zone for sure. But has there been any discussion, or has there any models out there? When obviously there's lots of airports where people are, I don't know, leafleting homes or actively notifying people, as Councilmember Anderson correctly noted.
So I do know the CDPHE and the toxicology branch put together an informational fact sheet on potential exposure to aviation leaded fuel. We can bring that forward to our Board of Health. But as far as the role of the Board of Health, I just want to be very mindful that we don't put them into a role of having to look at one study and determine is that appropriate enough for us to make a specific action or decision. We're talking, as Councilmember Hinkle talked about, toxicology reports and understanding that. And I do really think that we can explore it as a board, but the ultimate authority rests with CDPHE, given the infrastructure and their ability to examine the multiple studies out there and make recommendations.
So if we wanted to notify homeowners or renters within these zones, the appropriate way to do that is CDPHE.
Or us using the CDPHE language that they've already published on potential exposure to aviation fuels.
Council directing.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Henkel and then Shab.
Thank you, Mayor. I do want to make sure that we are educating the population, well, regardless if you're moving or not. I will say to Dr. Patel, if you want to come up here and answer this question, do you, in your opinion, feel, because it sounded like in order to go through the chelating process and or having testing and those sorts of things, it sounded like it was quite subjective within our medical community as far as do we really need to act upon this? Would we want to educate also our medical personnel?
So there is a huge dichotomy between what policy says and what the scientific community and the medical community oftentimes says about lead. And the CDC has gone forth and said there is no safe level of lead exposure for children. But if you actually go forward and please correct me if I'm wrong, but Director of Health, when he finds out this information, I believe they don't notify you until they hit 5 micrograms per deciliter. But science says well below that, you're still very much affected by lead. So you won't get a notification until you hit that level. And that's when the medical intervention will actually start happening, the chelation and things like that. So there's this huge dichotomy between what the science says and what doctors say, and then what, insurance providers and what policy says about this.
Okay. That sounds like it's a financial problem, and we've had that issue as well with benzene, right? There's no safe levels of benzene. Yet we constantly are putting benzene in our air, right? We're going to the gas stations. We will eventually go to more all electric automobiles and those sorts of things. Okay. Have we talked to the medical community in the area on their take on if they would support someone who has under that amount, or has there been any sort of stakeholder work on that?
No, I'm not aware of any stakeholder who's come out and say, yes, I do think that if you reach this level, they should chelate or something like that. Most just say elimination is the best, try to stop the exposure, because when it's already in your system, the damage is basically already done to some degree. So you want to prevent it rather than, after the fact, try to do something about it. That's the main message doctors and medical professionals oftentimes have on this subject.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, and I'm wondering too, if there's like a way that we can keep the information updated if we do notify people about this lead exposure, as to making sure that you guys aren't being emailed and called and saying, what are you doing, poisoning me? It would be more like, this is coming from us, we're partnering, this is our trajectory. In 2030, we should at least be here, or 2026, earlier. I think I would like to see a partnership in that, and making sure that this isn't a finger pointing game, and making sure that, I know that the onus needs to be on the industry just to do better. But also there are other things that we could also attack as well, like benzene and those sorts of things. So thank you. That's all.
All right, thank you. And finally, Councilmember Shaft.
All right, Mayor, I'll make this quick. So
That's okay.
we had provided staff some direction on a possible ordinance around this. And, hearing comments from Councilmember Anderson and Cohen, perhaps we, as Councilmember Marshall said, avoid another study session. But is there a way that we can avoid staff, a large amount of staff time and research and going into an ordinance, and really kind of come up with what could the possibility of addressing this issue to give notice, but without going into a whole ordinance crafting session?
So Councilmember Shaft, if I can jump in, the actual drafting, I don't think would be that long. I think we can utilize the oil and gas notification, which has a provision for lessees. I think the issue here is the assessment of the impact on this notification, and a look at some of our subdevelopment improvement agreements and what properties this would apply to. And so that piece of it, which may or may not have an impact on whether you're interested in passing this code provision, I think is important for staff to understand the applicability of this. So they need to know what to inform the developers, just thinking of Anna's staff. So while the initial drafting won't take very long, that second level of information could take some time.
And do you know how much of our of Broomfield is covered with the aviation easement?
80s, no, I actually have no idea.
I just wonder, so I think
I'm,
that.
I'm
part of-
sure we have that probably somewhere in the city. With for what's covered by Rocky Mountain and what's covered by Erie.
I mean, part of that aviation easement talks about concerns about noise, vibration.
Mhm.
You know, it would be easy to put that in there as well. Again, to Councilmember Anderson and Cohen, that, you know, that's not a whole lot of education in there.
Right,
And again, I don't know if the ordinance is going to do that much more than that anyway.
yeah, we have some good language in our current subdevelopment improvement agreement. And actually, while we were sitting here, I just pulled up what's in the Anthem one. It doesn't have the lead notification, but it does have other notifications about living near the Erie Airport, and we could use that language. So we definitely wouldn't have to recreate the wheel on the substance, except to make sure we're referencing lead.
Okay, all right, great. Thank you for that. Appreciate it, Mayor.
Oh, thank you. Anyone else? No? All right, then. Well, that concludes the agenda items for this evening study session. I really want to thank our presenters, Mr. Anslow and Dr. Boutel, and our Public Health Director who stepped up when asked. Thank you all so much for being here. And we will keep you posted as things progress. And I'll do what I can at the state to try to get us some protections. Thank you all.